Well, now it's your turn, and as is our custom, we'll ask you to turn your tent cards up. If you want to speak, we'll call on the forum members. And for those of you that in the audience who also want to ask a question, could line up at the microphone. So we'll start first with David Hemingway.
So Elizabeth, two questions. One, can you tell me what the homicides were really about when you first started the program? And secondly, has this all been written up and is this available as a success story so I can find it someplace in some journal or some report?
A lot of the cases of homicide were acquaintance homicide and involved with extortion. The earlier part of the epidemic of homicide seemed to have had some drug-related issues, but much more of it went into associated issues of extortion. And then a lot of it was once acquaintance violence that would go wrong, and groups from one area as against another area that would be looking for revenge on each other. Has it been properly written up? No. I think this is one of, maybe we could discuss some kind of partnership. One of the issues is the issue of external validation. We have not had anybody being any of the groups that work in Jamaica actually identifying funds to independently evaluate and do case control studies to validate what is here. So some things have been written up for IDRC, that's international research, and I could give you that.
Yes, Shelley.
Given the data that you've shown and the changes that have occurred in recent years, if you were looking forward in regard to adolescent access to guns, where do you see us in 3 to 5 years?
Obviously difficult to predict. I think looking at, I've looked at trends locally, nationally, states for a long time, and what's characteristic of gun violence is its cyclical nature. And what I'm hoping is that this little bend downward tells us we're in a downward cycle. We typically, and very commonly in public health context, talk about gun violence as a contagion and as a social contagion. And there's a lot of evidence that it operates exactly in that way. It's easiest to describe it as a problem. One person infects another and more guns and more shooting. But it also happens in reverse, so that the longer you go with no shootings or less violence, there is less motivation to arm yourself, to join a gang, to do all the risky things that make violence go up, particularly for youth. The other thing I think that, again, this is sort of educated speculation, I guess. There's important changes in the drug market going on, particularly as it relates to youth. When our youth homicide rates were so high in the early 90s, the way the market worked, in part response to our very harsh punishment and law enforcement against it, is you put out the youngest people out on the front lines because they were less vulnerable to those long prison sentences. And drug dealing and selling was a very, you had to know where to go when, it was very place-based, and you had to be out on the street. I think drug selling doesn't look like that quite as much these days because people can communicate with their smartphones and other ways. And you see a lot less street-level selling, and my suspicion is a lot less need for very young people in that market with their still developing brains and all the other stuff going on with them. So I'm cautiously optimistic and hopeful that we'll see this cycling downward and sort of nonviolence feed on itself, so to speak.
Thank you, Daniel, for an excellent review and presentation. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the knowledge you might have regarding the significant growth of U.S. There is a big dependency of U.S. gun dealers on Mexican demand for guns, and a sizable and growing percentage of U.S. Firearm sales are destined to Mexico. The volume of firearms crossing south of the border is increasing, and this seems to be related to the amount of drug trafficking organization and organized crime activities, as well as the increase in homicide and suicide in south of the border. And I was wondering if you could reflect on how some of these policies that you mentioned could be applied elsewhere, if you think that they have cross-cultural possibilities for working with youth and police efforts south of the border. Thank you.
Interesting and challenging question. First, a disclaimer. I can't pretend that I'm an expert on cross-border gun trafficking. I know a little bit about that. But it strikes me as some real parallels to when our drug violence was really surging, with a lot of chaos in essence, a lot of competition, if you will, within that drug market, again, in the late 80s, early 90s. And with the U.S. policymakers' assistance with a lot of deregulation in the late 1980s, the gun industry filled that demand. There was a demand for guns as violence was surging in these drug markets, and it was supplied with gun dealers who were, willing to make probably risky sales. Chaos and violence surging in Mexico provides opportunities for gun sellers, particularly on the southwest border. And those are the states, of course, except for California, with pretty lax firearm sales policies. There's very notable differences across the states in terms of who's supplying guns used in Mexico. California, as I alluded to before, has fairly rigorous firearm sales policies, comprehensive background checks, assault weapon bans, very strong regulation and oversight of licensed gun dealers. So very few guns sold originally in California are being used in Mexico based upon the data I've seen. Most of them are coming from other states. So I think, obviously there's huge political challenges that really are the heart of this. But right now, our policymakers have, in essence, allowed profit making from the violence that's going on in Mexico. Your other question sort of had to do, if I understood correctly, with some of the strategies to reduce gun carrying, gun use, particularly among high-risk individuals, many of them young people, and whether that's exportable. Actually, my colleague, John Speed Myers, examined some of this in a master's project that he did at Princeton, at least looking at this within probably most challenging context in Honduras for focused deterrence. And I'll speak a little bit for John Speed, and he can speak up for himself if he'd like, but it was very difficult to imagine that being as effective in places where the general institutions were so weak, with a great deal of corruption, and the gangs and the drug sellers had so much more resources and power it was very difficult to use the tools that have been very effective in many U.S. cities to have them to work in that environment. At least that's was his assessment. So I think, this is something I learned long ago. The first time I actually taught my violence prevention class at Johns Hopkins about 24 years ago to a very international set of students. And I was told by a young woman from the Philippines that, very politely, of course, that, many of the things that I was suggesting just simply won't work in certain places where those institutions are so fragile and human rights not what they are here.
Thank both of you for a really, I think, thought-provoking panel discussion. And Daniel, I felt like you helped us think a lot about the issues of availability and regulation of firearms related to youth gun violence. And then hearing about the work in Jamaica and multiple interventions in a community that made a difference. I think both of those were really inspiring. I keep finding myself coming back to a question, though, about the larger environment in which we all live, in which gun violence is seen as entertainment and promoted in marketing and by the entertainment industry. And I'm wondering if either of you have some comments on whether there are some policy opportunities and how that might shape how our youth perceive their risks, their social norms, and so forth in this area of gun violence and youth. Thank you.
I'll take a crack at that. So I guess I'm inferring that you're sort of getting at violence in the media, violence in video games, and sort of sensationalizing, those kinds of things. And so here, I think regulation on that has been very difficult. And I just haven't seen anything that sort of works within the U.S. Again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I got to be cautious about this. But I'd like to just sort of speak to the more direct issue about violent video games and all the violent media and how important that is. There's volumes of research that show that exposure to that kind of stuff definitely increases aggressive behavior, and it's sort of beyond doubt. An interesting thing that I think has not been studied is when you do that on a more experimental basis, you see this aggressive behavior. But particularly in the context of video games and how much time, I have I have a son and a daughter, teenagers. I know how much time they spend on their electronic devices, okay? And social interaction is different today. They are in their basements texting or doing whatever they're doing, or they're playing their video games, rather than actually being face-to-face in a variety of risky encounters that might lead to violence. So if you look at the increase in violent media consumption by our young people in recent years and decades, you'll see it go up very substantially. Yet, as I showed you in the graphs, our violence measures with gun violence are more trending in the opposite direction. So I think it's a very complicated scenario that while I try to keep my adolescents from those exposures, I don't like what they do to them, their brains and everything. I don't know that that will be our solution to really driving down our rates of gun violence that are unusually high.
We have to yield the floor to the gentleman from Michigan, Raul Huesman. This question is a softball to you.
Dan, I appreciate most of the things you've said, but what you just said, I must disagree with. In fact, it's the ecological fallacy to conclude because violence rates are going down and video game usage is going up, violent video games are not causing violent behavior. In fact, they're not just experimental studies, there are now longitudinal studies that show that pretty conclusively, that kids who constantly play violent video games are more likely to engage in real, serious violent behavior. You know, everyone looks at their own kids, and there's something in communication research that's known as the third person effect. And I hear this all the time. Well, violent videos or violent video games may affect other people, but they don't affect my kids. They know the difference between fantasy and reality. So it's, you know, it's very difficult when we're faced with that to then turn to the objective scientific evidence. But if you do, it's not just the experimental evidence. There's longitudinal field studies that now show this pretty conclusively.
Very briefly, I wasn't at all questioning whether exposure to violent media causes aggressive or violent behavior. That is established, whether it's experimental or field studies or whatever. The question I have right now that I personally don't think has been examined is the availability of, you know, so much of this does change how much our youth are actually face-to-face with their peers. And that is the only context in which somebody can get shot. So, and one final point I'll just say is I suspect that none of the very fine research that you have done has actually looked at shootings as the outcome. And so, again, I don't question the violent media promotes violent behavior. What I'm saying it's a more complex phenomenon to think about what effect that may or may not be having on risks for gun violence to youth in the United States.
I mean, that's absolutely true, Dan. Just two more things. One is the research shouldn't indict all video games. There are many great video games that bring kids together.
Yeah.
You know, Guitar Hero, Mind, Escape, so on, that not only teach positive mental activities, but promote good social behavior. I'm not trying to indict that. But actually, I would say we do have already some evidence that at least self-reports of threatening someone with a gun or shooting someone, that was the question, are related to having played violent video games. And you might have seen the article that Michelle Ibarra and I published in Aggressive Behavior on self-reports of gun carrying are related to the extent people report previously that they play violent video games.
One interesting thing is the Broadcasting Commission in Jamaica has banned use of violent lyrics in songs, and it's reported on, and it would be interesting to see over time. The other thing is, in a recent anti-gang legislation, it was again put into legislation that the use of violent lyrics in music was to become illegal. I think it's sending a message, but what has happened to the whole culture in Jamaica, or the subculture in Jamaica, it's just pervaded by violence and pervaded by these video games and movies and that sort of thing. And I'll always remember one of the UNICEF ambassadors who was a child soldier said every time before he went out on a raid in Africa, they played Rambo 5 times and sent them out with guns.
Reminds me a little bit of Jim Mercy's point earlier this morning that we're not so much dealing with an epidemic, but that this is endemic. And, you know, when you think about this, the ecological model and all the various ways in which the interaction of all the systems and I guess, the social ecology within which kids are engaged in getting access to guns and carrying guns. One of the things that struck me about your slide was that you talked about for a number of kids that they get the guns from their family members or from friends. And to what extent, I guess you don't know the intent or the reason for giving these guns, but to what extent would interventions targeting these kind of gun givers, if you will, would that be effective? Have you done any work in that regard? Are people aware that they're not just passing on a gun, but that they're passing on the potential for this lethal action?
So, good question. In the interviews I've done myself and the data that I've looked at myself, pertinent to these, you know, I got it from a family member kind of transaction. This was not dad handing down the hunting rifle. This was, you have to remember just how concentrated the problem of gun violence is. In again, I use that term criminogenic environment. Many of these youth, they have parents, uncles, cousins, whomever, who are involved in gangs and a variety of illegal activities. An interesting thing that researchers have tried to sort of tease apart is the degree to which the gun carrying is purely, okay, it's dangerous out there, protect yourself, here's a gun, as opposed to here's something that you can, you know, be violent with, rob, do whatever violent things. And it's very difficult because many of these people are engaged in risky behaviors already. And so the uncle or whoever sees that, okay, Johnny is running with a rough crowd, may not be a bad idea to have a gun with you because a lot of those other guys do too, and you don't want to be the one without it. I think that's sort of the kind of context that these transfers occur under. So it's rather complex. They will say, here's something to protect yourself, but you have to understand what that context is of why that young person needs protection. And he needs protection because he's doing a lot of risky things with a lot of risky people.
In your paper, you didn't get a chance to talk about it as much in your presentation, but you were talking about the kind of passing on of guns and the difficulty in tracing it, and I would imagine with the street cult, with these kind of street market, underground market, and so forth, that makes it even more difficult to trace the use of a gun in a homicide or some other criminal activity. Tomorrow, we're having a bit of a discussion on smart guns, and I just wondered if there are any technologies that might include GPS chips or something in these guns so that would help facilitate the tracing, if you're aware of any such things on the horizon.
Well, actually, I think one of, Steve will cover smart guns very well tomorrow, I'm sure. One new technology that I think could be incredibly important in addressing gun violence is something called microstamping. The vast majority of times when shootings occur, a gun is not recovered. So the ability to sort of track it down and where it came from and in whose hands and those kind of things is off the table because there's no gun. We promote, for good reason, use of what's called a NIBIN system of using electronic images of ballistic evidence to try to connect, you know, whether the same gun was used at multiple shootings. But with microstamping approach, and there's actually a law in the books in California, thanks in part to Josh Horowitz, who's with us today, in which when the gun manufacturers would have to, in essence, using lasers, put on something that would identify a shell casing so that if a shell casing is picked up by law enforcement, they would know, in essence, the same thing they would know if they would trace a gun. So they could say, using this tag on it, you could say this gun was sold by this gun shop, and this gun shop would do the same thing that a trace would do of a gun and say, oh, this gun was sold to, you know, Bob Smith on April 24, 2010, and be able to trace it from there. So I think microstamping could open up a lot of possibilities. Of course, there's great industry opposition to this, but I think technologically, we should be able to do this and make it far riskier to use or transfer a gun illegally. If you know that there's such a good chance that they, you know, if you just purchase this gun and you know that this microstamped, I'm going to get in trouble if I use it or if someone I give to it is, you know, use it in a crime of violence. So I hope that that's something that we see soon.
Well, thank you all for a very provocative discussion, and unfortunately, we're out of time, so Stephen, you'll have to ask your question during the break. Or back home, indeed. Thank you. We'll take a brief break and be back at 2:15. Thank you.